And we are live. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Wait for a few people to join before we start. Okay, I will just get started. So welcome to our Webinar Wednesday series at CyberData Pros. My name is Kylie and I'll be hosting this event today. I also have Alex McMath here, who is a data privacy and security analyst here at CyberData Pros. Today we'll be discussing reasons why data breaches occur and share practical tips on how to keep your organization safe.
All right. Well, thanks for the introduction, Kylie. I'm excited to talk about this topic. There's a lot for us to cover today. So don't hesitate to say hello at any point you join in, or if you have any questions, we'll have a period at the end to cover any of those. Like I said, we got a lot to cover, so I guess we can get started if we're about ready.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I have a slide presentation I put together here. You can see the first slide, data breaches and why they occur. All right. So as in the age we live in, information is power, information is money. We've heard all this before, whether it's personal data, financial records, or even the preferences you may express when you like a photo online. All of that is valuable to advertisers and attackers. Like any treasure, though, it can be stolen, and in some cases, your own data can be used against you. And in these instances, we're talking about data breaches. And me and my team have discussed many times over why these are scary. We won't focus too much on that today. We want to look a little bit more into how to prevent them. And a big way to prevent data breaches is getting to grips with why they occur in the first place. Now, that question might sound like it has a super technical answer at first, and in some elements it does, but really it's interwoven with things like human behavior, economic factors, tech advancements, and a lot more than that. In fact, there's much more to discuss in the broad scope than we could even cover in this session today. But today we're going to try and get the main factors we can see in the best way I could distill it down for you. So we're going to focus on three main elements. We're going to look at first the human elements. These are things that as people we do intentionally or unintentionally that can leave the door ajar for any attackers we might have. Then we'll look into more of the technical elements we're familiar with and see what really is responsible for the majority of breaches in terms of those technicalities. And finally, we're going to touch a little bit on external factors that people don't always think of when evaluating a plan. And these are often things we find with clients we like to add in as further considerations. So that's what we'll be discussing, but don't worry, the session is not going to be all doom and gloom about why these breaches occur. We're also going to look at some ways into how to prevent them. So let's jump right in here to the human element and look at the one common thread binding us all, our shared humanity. In cybersecurity, whether you're a tech guru or a novice, the human element in security is something we've all got to deal with. For the sake of our time here, we're breaking this element down and the other elements down into the three main components. And in this case, for the human element, it's going to be insider threats. These are actions by individuals within the organization that either intentionally or unintentionally harm the company or its resources. This could be anything from a malicious attack from a disgruntled employee or even a simple mistake by someone otherwise innocent. We have phishing attacks. This is a method you've probably all heard of before. It's a deception-based attack that cybercriminals use to try and get leaks of personal or confidential information. It's often done by impersonating a trustworthy entity. And then we have poor password management. This touches on like the inadequate creation, storage, handling of passwords. I'm sure we're all guilty of that to some extent or another. We're going to give some best practices for how to avoid that, both yourself and from an administrative standpoint. So this all sounds pretty simple in concept. These are concepts we've heard before, but each of these aspects is kind of like a puzzle, and they touch on nuances with psychology, sociology, and the tech we use here. So like any good puzzle, they demand attention and curiosity and investigation. And that's what we're going to focus on here today. I mean, let's think about insider threats a little bit, for instance. A lot of people think, I trust my team. I'm not going to do, I'm not going to think they're going to do anything malicious. But a lot of times, insider threats, we're not talking about malicious intent at all. I mean, that definitely happens, but oftentimes insider threats can come from things just like accidents, miscommunications, even an email going out to the wrong person would be scoped under that. And looking at things like phishing, it doesn't stop at these half-hearted impersonation emails with, complete joke spelling and grammar. It can be a whole art form with things like spear phishing, where an intense amount of effort and artistry really goes into creating some psychological mess that can prey on, emotions like fear, urgency, or trust. And then we have poor password management. Again, like I said, I think we're all guilty of it. We've all used one password once, twice, maybe 20 times. But I think it's underestimated sometimes what a door that can open for attackers, or even what, one or two good password management processes can be mitigated by one bad one. So the beauty, or perhaps, the main challenge of the human element here is it's not all about tech savvy criminals breaking into our systems here. A lot of times we have to think past tech and into the humans. So let's dive right in and take a look at the insider threats. So insider threats are security risks that come from within the organization. It can be an employee, a contractor, or a business partner. And like I said before, not all insider threats are malicious. But let's start with that. We've heard of instances where an individual within an organization intentionally leaks, steals, or damages information. That can come from an angry employee, or maybe someone, hired from without, sent to spy and steal intellectual property. We want to keep aware of these threats because they have access, knowledge, and in some cases, a motive. But these threats can also come from accidental leaks. These are the unintentional instigators of our story here. There's many instances where there's a well-meaning colleague who accidentally emails sensitive data to the wrong person, or maybe leaves their computer unlocked. It's an innocent mistake, but it still represents an insider threat and has consequences just as dire. And finally, we have a subtler culprit, a lack of awareness. The unaware of people who deal with data or organizational procedures, they can easily cause harm without meaning to at all, just by lack of substantial training. So those are the three vectors by which we see insider threats originating. And realistically, this is broad enough where it could come from just about anywhere. But addressing insider threats, we have to think past the paranoia of these could come from anywhere, and think about how to solve them through education, awareness, and creating a culture of responsibility. So to resolve it, we think of things like I said, training. We want to talk about the do's and don'ts of data handling as part of our annual security awareness trainings. That's important because data handling can change from year to year. For instance, we have AI coming in full force this year that changes how data is handled in some regards. We have monitoring and controls. We want to, of course, put measures in place like access controls and secure password management that allow us to detect suspicious activity and audit it going forward without breaching privacy. And of course, we want to keep a culture of open communication. If somebody notices an insider threat, they need to be able to report that without feeling like they might be roped in or incriminated, or like they might have something blown back at them. If people are able to report issues as they see them, that saves so much bandwidth in terms of monitoring on your end. And it's really impossible to do without having that cultural element there. So to this end, tackling insider threats is not a battle, it's more of a dance. You have to think in terms of not just strict controls, but the human element, how we can mix in training for how to, prevent these unintentional breaches from happening, and a culture where we can report where if we do see a malicious threat, it can be pushed forward. And that, in a lot of cases, can wipe out most of this threat. That will bring us next to phishing attacks. Now, we're not just talking about a weekend at the pond, we're talking at the digital deception here that we've seen trip up even the savviest of users online. So at a base level, what's phishing? It's an attempt at fraud where attackers disguise themselves as otherworthy or otherwise trustworthy entities like a bank or a social media site, or maybe even a friend of yours. They can craft emails or messages that look very much real with the logos, language, and all that might be associated with that, but they usually hide something of a hook. So what are some of these common hooks or techniques used in phishing? Well, first and foremost, we have email spoofing. This is really the classic. I'm sure many of us at some point or another have received an email, say from your bank, asking you to update your information urgently. In recent years, I've seen more from Amazon saying that a package that I don't remember ordering is undeliverable. A lot of times, this can look genuine with the right logo and email address. To prevent these, we want to look closer, and sometimes you can find subtle inconsistencies that can tip you off. On the other hand, we have things like website cloning. This one's a little trickier, where attackers might make their own version of an otherwise legitimate website. And they'll make their own login page and everything that you can enter your information into. Say you click on their link, you've just delivered your information directly to their databases instead of possibly your bank's. And finally, a common technique we see really frequently with texting is urgent language, where someone will pretend to be your supervisor asking for a task to be completed urgently, or maybe they'll try and be Amazon saying they're giving you some unlimited time offer. Urgency, just as a tactic overall, we find to be the most common flavor of phishing. And usually that's because it's the most effective. People tend not to think as carefully or analyze these messages as much if they know they have to move quickly. So with that in mind, what can we do to prevent ourselves from falling victim to these kind of phishing techniques? Well, first, we can check the content. Plenty of us have seen phishing emails before, and they are commonly ridden with spelling or grammar errors. If not that, often the URLs within the phishing links they give you or attachments are strange. Usually big organizations are pretty good about having their spelling and attachments named properly. Any of those things, if you notice they're out of place, odds are pretty high that that would be a phishing email, or at least one to be suspicious of. One you might want to double check. If you do want to double check an email, say again, it's an Amazon delivery that you've never heard of, but it otherwise looks perfect, it's a good idea to verify with the source. If an email seems suspicious, try contacting the parent company in a separate email so you're not replying to the possibly fraudulent address. And just ask them, forward it, say, is this something from you? And a lot of times they can clarify it for you. A little bit of suspicion in cases like these can go a long way. I think people can often be surprised when they do come back and find, yeah, that's not from who you thought it was. And finally, if we're looking at a more organizational level, the utilization of security tools such as endpoint detection and response, or any kind of email filtering can often pick up on the signatures or signature elements of a phishing email and prevent those from reaching an inbox to begin with. That's nice because, again, that takes out the human factor. But of course, we want to always account for that in terms of training and things like these. So that wraps up most of what we have for phishing, keep in mind, it's not all about, the technical element, the security tools. It definitely helps, but it really pays to train your employees and make sure that they can resist the urgency, greed, fear, whatever that might be preyed on with these types of phishing emails. All right, and finally, for the human element, we have something we all deal with daily, but often overlook, but it's worth paying attention to: password management. Passwords are the keys to your digital kingdom. They guard your personal photos, your bank account, work documents. If you lose the key or hand it over carelessly, you're inviting trouble. So what are some common mistakes we see with password management? Well, first and foremost, it's easily guessable passwords. I'm sure we all know about this, password 123456 QWERTY. For as obvious as it seems to avoid them, they are used very frequently. They are still the most common passwords on the internet. You can look up a top 10 list. We want to obviously avoid those where we can, because that's the first things attackers are going to check. Past that, we want to avoid using the same password over and over. If you use the same key for every lock and one gets picked, all your doors are effectively open. We're using the same password over and over. It only takes one breach or one crack, and they have everything that uses that password, which can be pretty alarming for some folks when they think about how far one password could go for them. And finally, we have not updating passwords regularly. And this one is actually a pretty big deal, because a lot of times, even if you're using one password per site, a password breach on a site you used long ago can lead to that password becoming, invalid for future use. And a lot of times people might cycle through different passwords on different sites. If you do not update passwords regularly, it only takes one breach for you to lose that password forever and get caught exposed at some point. So let's take a look at a real life example of how often this can really happen and what an impact it can have. Adobe had an infamous 2013 breach where something like 3 million encrypted customer card records were breached. It was a pretty huge deal at the time. And this came in part from encrypted passwords being stolen from Adobe's database. The shocker here was that a lot of these were super basic passwords, like 123456 we talked about before. And this seemingly trivial mistake made it a lot easier for the attackers to broaden the scope of their attack, and led to the exposure of millions of user accounts versus maybe just hundreds of thousands. Lots of people were left exposed for one password on one site they didn't take seriously enough. So all this said, we definitely want strong passwords, but how do we get those? Well, many of these we see suggested in password generators, but this is for a good reason. We want to include a mix of characters. Of course, we want some uppercase, lowercase, numbers, symbols. This avoids a lot of the most common passwords, so at least it'll be hard to guess. Past that, we recommend using a passphrase. Believe it or not, lengthy passwords of simple characters are typically a lot more secure to brute force attacks than complex short ones. So using a passphrase like "I love to eat pizza at night" is really long, and if you mix that in with, a couple numbers, one special character, it will take to the heat death of the universe for most data brute force attacks to crack that. And the nice thing about those is they're pretty easy to remember too. And finally, try considering a password manager for your organization. Again, this is a technical control we can implement, but things like 1Password or LastPass can generate and store complex passwords for you. And they, past a small user training ridge, they can actually make a pretty big difference. They tend to be adopted pretty quickly because they're not super hard to use. They're designed for end users to grasp quickly. And these are great because you have it all in one location. You don't have to remember them all, and it does all the salting, hashing, all the technical things you would want to do with passwords for you. And past that, of course, we've all heard about it in recent years, two-factor authentication. It's an extra layer of security that does not hurt. It adds a an exponentially higher curve of difficulty to cracking account. So we're not saying you need some Fort Knox levels of defense for your Netflix account, but it's worth keeping in mind that passwords are valuable keys that open a lot of doors in the digital world. And I think any weakness in passwords on one site can, maybe in ways you wouldn't expect, lead to weakening in other sites. So it's good to just practice good practices with this overall. That moves us on to the technical element. So this is where the rubber really meets the road. It's where our systems, networks, and devices come into play, and we can touch a lot on the more technical controls here. So let's take a quick look at what we're facing in this chapter. You can imagine your organization's technical infrastructure kind of like a medieval fortress, right? The walls, moats, and gates are your main security measures here, and that's kind of what we'll be representing in this chapter. Of course, when your gates are left ajar and the walls are left unpatched or the moats dry up, it can cause some significant issues for that castle security. Let's see how in this session. So we have weak patching first and foremost. You can think of this kind of like cracks in the walls of your fortress. A vulnerability is like a hole in your organization, and that's something that can be exploited to get into your network, into your devices, into your data. If ignored over time, these cracks can widen and the walls only get weaker with time. So you need to be vigilant about keeping these devices, endpoints, and patching up to date and in context of whatever's happening at the time, timely. We have weak endpoint security. This is kind of akin to the guards who might be monitoring coming and going out of the gates. If the gates in an organization cannot hold up to attack, if they're easy to bypass, any kind of weak endpoint security controls that could be exploited dive right into a machine, that just creates more ways for attackers to get in. And that doesn't even involve super complicated exploits like patches might avoid. Sometimes it's just walking into an open door. And finally, we have weak network security. You can think that kind of like a moat around a fortress. If the moat's shallow and easily crossed, it's really not of much use. But if it's kept up to date and kept, filled up, that's going to keep a lot of trash and detritus from hitting your defenses to begin with. So altogether, there's a triad of weaknesses with patching, endpoint security, and network security that create the vast majority of data breaches that you'll see in the wide world that aren't human caused. So if one aspect's weak here, it can affect the others. We need to make sure all three of these are functioning optimally if we really want to call ourselves secure. So let's take a dive into these aspects. First, we have weak patch management. This kind of could be a metaphor of a crumbling wall, like we discussed. We see holes open up over time with our security endpoints. It happens just as new hacks come out and new software is pushed out. It's inevitable, which means we need a way to manage those holes, and that way is patch management. That's the practice of updating software with code changes over time to help fix or enhance those programs, or rules in our administrative posture. It's kind of like mending the cracks in fortress walls. Done well, it keeps our security robust. Done poorly, it can actually weaken your defenses more than if we left it alone to begin with. So patches are important to address vulnerabilities as we see them, but what are some issues we see with administering them commonly? Well, first we have ignoring updates, like we discussed. If you see a small crack in your posture, be it a update that's missed and you continue to miss further updates, that crack is just going to widen and widen and widen as the vulnerabilities get more in number and severity. It's worth keeping in mind when a patch comes out and dictates that they've fixed vulnerabilities, that's something attackers can see too. And it points them out that older versions of whatever software you might be using has those sort of vulnerabilities in that area. So typically after a patch comes out, older versions, just by the very nature of patch notes, get a little bit weaker. Past that, we have patch testing or a lack thereof. If patches aren't tested on a routine basis, a patch can actually cause more harm than good. If you send out a patch over your entire organization that somehow disables a feature that you need to operate efficiently, of course, that can cost the organization quite a lot. So before we push forward a patch, we always want to test it on 1 or 2 machines and make sure it's operating as we want it to. Finally, we have inconsistent application. A lot of times people can be a little top heavy with their patch management. They can identify a few machines as they view being vulnerable, but ignore other machines completely. You know, if the security staff is all updating their machines, but a few people in HR or development aren't, oftentimes, you know, as we've heard, security is only as strong as the weakest link. And it really pays to make sure that application of patching is done with equal attention all across the board on endpoints. So what happens when patching goes wrong? Well, some consequences are you have obviously security breaches. Unpatched vulnerabilities are a hole right for going through and stealing data. It creates compliance issues. So even if you're not breached, you can have this found out by regulatory bodies or even clients, and that can cause, you know, a loss of reputation, like we discussed beyond, or it can lead to some pretty severe fines. So what are some best practices to help keep management as simple as possible? Well, we can start with regular monitoring. We want to keep an eye on cracks and know when they appear. We want to always keep an eye on what's happening in the organization, any kind of alerting within a SIM, or just be aware if we're a Windows organization that we need to see when Windows patches come out. Oftentimes, it's good to set up automated updates. You know, we can let technology do a lot of the heavy lifting for us in some instances, which is fantastic. If you can automate or manage updates at an organizational level, and of course, like we discussed, we want to test it first, but after a point, it's good. Maybe after a week or 2 after a patch comes out, yeah, we might want to try and get those on every user device without interference, because sometimes when left up to users, patches will just never get done. And finally, a clear patching policy. If you don't want to do automated updates, that's a great avenue to go, where you just set the expectations on a policy document as part of hiring. Everyone needs to know what patches to apply and when and what's expected otherwise, or maybe IT would have to go in and administer a patch themselves. So overall, patch management, especially when it's weak, is not something to overlook. That's a flaw and a defense that can lead to big consequences long term, and it's something that's really easy to let build up behind you and can be a pain to catch up on. But regular attention, clear policies, and really proactivity can do a lot to make patch management, instead of a problem for you, it can really turn into a solution. So let's look over to endpoint security next. This, if your network is a fortress, the endpoints will kind of like be the gates. You know, it's the access points to and from where traffic will go. So what happens when these gates are left unfortified? This takes us to endpoint security as a concept. So it's about securing the entry and exit points of a network, endpoints. And what are endpoints? These are devices such as computers, mobile devices, or servers that connect to a network. Basically, any access points where threats can enter and propagate. So these access points, like gates, need to be protected if you want to control the state of the network or fortress. So some issues we commonly see that cause weak endpoint security are unprotected devices, major vulnerabilities or lack of proper management of devices can lead to easy entry points. You have malware infiltration. If a virus gets on one device and the device security isn't great overall on the network, the malware can spread a lot easier. And finally, unauthorized access. A weak posture of endpoints typically leads to weak access controls. And not only does this lead to problems keeping devices secure to begin with, but say something goes wrong with an insider threat or something equivalent, you will lose some of your ability to detect incidents as they occur, which slows down your recovery efforts. And it leads to a loss of accountability that allow you to investigate incidents in retrospect as well. So what are some of the more major mistakes we see with endpoint security? For one, it's lack of monitoring. If endpoints aren't monitored by some sort of mobile device management or SIMS or anything like that, you won't really know what's coming in and out until it's already been in or out or reported. And that hampers our ability to be proactive about these sort of things. We have inconsistent policies. Sometimes organizations aren't very careful with how they will define what needs to be on a secured endpoint. This can create some inconsistencies that lead to just overall weakness. If someone has conflicting information about what makes a secure endpoint, odds are almost no endpoints are going to wind up truly secure that you don't administer yourself. And finally, we have outdated protection measures. Maybe you're up to date in terms of patches for one sort of endpoint security you're using, but maybe that endpoint security device as a whole is sort of out of use in terms of the modern attacks out there. As the industry develops, you want to see what people are securing their endpoint devices with and try to adapt to incorporate those as well. Security is something that's always a moving target, and so we have to move to meet it. That all said, it sounds difficult, but let's give some best practices to secure these endpoints. First, we have regular scanning, be this vulnerability scanning or something as simple as just checking the logs on devices overall. Periodic checks can help make sure everything's secure, that nothing's gone wrong, that there's not some unauthorized access that's currently moving through your network, and again, helps a lot with proactive action. Unified security policies, having a standard of what endpoint security is across the organization, boosts the chances of it actually being used. And finally, multi-factor authentication. Yet again, in terms of preventing unauthorized access on these devices, if a technical failing comes in, MFA, for as many problems as it might have with some users, it serves to be a significantly bigger problem for attackers. So overall, that should cover us for endpoint security here. Next, we have weak network security. So imagine your network being kind of like a castle. We want a solid moat around it to keep a lot of the trash or foxes from jumping in and getting to our rabbits. And that's what network security entails. So to define it a bit, network security is about safeguarding your computer network from unauthorized access, intruders, and various forms of cyber threats. And we really want to emphasize the importance of network security, as the right network security measures can help prevent unauthorized access, data breaches, and improve network performance. It's really one of those measures that will filter out the vast majority of issues for you if it's set up correctly, which is great because it can be resource intensive to respond to attacks and to really patch everything else up. I mean, if everything before this has sounded complicated, this is really the answer to get the bulk of our worries away. So it's something we really want to be careful with. So let's take a look at some common issues that we see in networks that we look at. We have open ports. These are kind of like dry spots in your moat. They're ways for people to enter that you might not necessarily know about, but they nonetheless can grant access to a network or be used for attacks. And in most cases, these open ports, people don't know about, they don't use them for any sort of protocols, and they're not missed when they're closed. So even one port scan determination of what ports are being used can go a long way in shoring up network security. You have unsecured Wi-Fi. Not everybody keeps the guest networks or even main net Wi-Fi networks at their companies as secure as they should be. Be this open passwords or open networks entirely, or even smaller things like sharing SSIDs to where attackers might be able to find the network more easily than they would ever need to be able to. Unsecured Wi-Fi has got to be the biggest intrusion you can have on your network, with the probably easiest way of defending against it. And finally, a lack of a robust firewall can cause major issues with your network. Of course, the firewall effectively serves as the water in your moat in many ways, where you're only going to allow what needs to get in over areas where you know about it. So you definitely want to have a firewall configured to where you know what's happening, what's coming and going. And one other thing I guess I should mention is using default credentials. This goes into unsecured Wi-Fi, but also your router, any other kind of device. Sometimes people will leave the default credentials on a router, Wi-Fi network, what have you. And it sounds crazy, but I wouldn't mention it if it didn't happen. People can look up the default passwords for these devices. And there's these attacks called war driving, where people will just drive around and try default credentials on passwords that they, or on SSIDs that they notice. Of course, we just want to change that. And what are some consequences of weak network security? Well, again, that can lead us to having stolen data. Can cause a huge amount of issues, including these follow-up ones, legal ramifications. Can cost us contracts in terms of compliance. It can lead to loss of trust with our customers. And in some instances, if depending on what happens with our compliance, it can lead to a complete like a violation going through the government entity. So let's take a look at some practices we could incorporate to help strengthen network security. First, we have the use of firewalls. Like I said before, we want to have a firewall that's thoroughly configured to have all the rules, ports enabled that only are needed and something that we can audit. We want to secure Wi-Fi with encryption and secure passwords where we can, of course. And finally, we want to regularly monitor and keep strong credentials on our network. We want to make sure these password policies that we were talking about earlier are brought to the network as well. In fact, I think you'll see a lot of these controls interweave to make a bigger difference altogether. And that's all we have for network security and the technical element. I know a lot of the matters we discussed here are things we hear now and then, but it's for good reason. It's stuff we see often. And again, these beginner steps can make a really significant difference in helping prevent data breaches down the line. But doesn't cover necessarily everything. So let's take a little time to think about more of the hidden weaknesses that lurk in the shadows when it comes to data breaches. These are other elements, things you might not think of at first, but they can undermine your security just as easily as a weak password or an unguarded gate in certain circumstances. We're going to look at these elements that might not be on the front lines of defense, but play a vital role in helping make sure it's secure. So first, we're going to look at lack of awareness and training. You can have the most robust security measures in place, but if your staff isn't educated and trained, it's like having a otherwise strong fortress with weak guards and routines. We have supply chain issues. Your whole organization might be strong on its own right, but what about the trade routes you have coming in and out, or other castles you might be dealing with? Supply chain issues can lead to data that you might have handled otherwise correctly being put into your partner's hands, and you find yourself liable for a breach that they incurred. And finally, we have economic and industry restraints. Obviously, we talk a lot about different controls and devices we can incorporate, but the reality of the matter is these things can cost money and resources that not everybody has to spare in their organization. Smaller companies sometimes have to scale back their efforts and look at what is realistic for their place in the market. And we'll look into some of those and what we can do to address weaknesses in that regard. So let's take a look right into lack of awareness and training. So educating employees about the various threats they might face is kind of like training the guards of the fortress. They need to know, if they want to protect you, what they're supposed to be protecting against and how to recognize suspicious activities when they see them. So issues that can come into lack of training can include falling for phishing, clicking on unknown or suspicious links, oversharing information on social media, or practicing weak password habits. Basically, the things we talked about in the human element here are things we want to bring forward in our training going forward. And of course, we want to make sure that we're training on a routine basis here. We can't assume that training for 1 year is going to apply for the next 10. Our cybersecurity posture changes annually, and trainings should occur on that sort of basis so we can routinely adapt it and keep our awareness fresh. So overall, we want to look at how we can implement effective training programs. Typically, this comes from assessing what's happening in any given year if you're using annual trainings. And we want to tailor that to the company at hand. Recently we did a HIPAA training, and HIPAA training for a hospital is different than HIPAA training for a marketing company. They have completely different concerns and responsibilities under HIPAA, and it's the same thing with user training. They might have different issues that come to play, and that's a big part. You want to have someone who can customize the training to you and create a culture firsthand that's going to be conducive to making sure that those policies actually get seen out. So we're going to look into the next slide here, into supply chain issues. This is a surprisingly major thing for a lot of companies that can cause breaches where it's out of their hands completely. Of course, we don't live in isolation on the internet here. We share data with other companies, things like Google, Salesforce, what have you, sometimes weaker vendors. And with weaker vendors, a data breach on their end can lead to data that you were otherwise trusted with being exposed. And if you do not have solid contracts in place or security measures in place for transfer, the liability for their mistakes can come to you. So what's really critical in supply chain issues is knowing the security policy of suppliers, making sure that you're doing your due diligence when deciding on any sort of vendors you may have, and evaluating them to make sure that they're actually following through with the security commitments that they're promising. On top of that, of course, we want to stipulate in our contracts and be conscious of where we're assigning liability in terms of what our end is for supplying controls and whatever the vendor's end should be. So altogether, if we can implement vendor risk management as a policy and perform audits on these vendors and make sure that we're careful with our contracts, this will prevent down the road a lot of issues with vendors. And it's good to be proactive on this because it's a lot easier to get these sort of contracts and DPAs and like signed upfront than further down the line renegotiating responsibilities with systems that you're already deeply integrated in. All right, and finally, let's look at some of the economic and industry restraints that can come up. So often organizations face limited funding for security infrastructure, staff training, and necessary tech upgrades. This constraint kind of acts like a hidden wall and it can really impede our ability to get the kind of defense posture we look like. There's only so much time and money we can put into these things. So striking a balance between compliance costs and investments in security is a challenge. And to that end, we want to have routine assessments that can help us decide what exactly needs to be done for an organization with our scope and posture. This is especially apparent with things like smaller businesses who a lot of major security products wind up being geared towards these enterprise type solutions. And the pricing typically reflects that. It pushes support and things like that outside of the scope of what a smaller business might otherwise be able to afford. So to that end, it really helps to have custom fitted solutions to you, be it through a consultancy like us here, or um, investigating more thoroughly the sort of vendors that cater to small markets can do a lot to overcome these restraints. On top of that, it's smart to get periodic audits done to help decide what your role in the industry is. For example, under CCPA or GDPR, only certain entities are defined as businesses or controllers or processors. So a lot of times, a big part of the battle is understanding where you stand and your responsibilities. And to that end, audits or just assessments into your role in these sort of industries can make a big deal. Now, of course, these risks can change depending on the industry, be it healthcare, finance, retail. You have different standards you might have to abide by and different controls you might want to implement. That's also a big role in why periodic assessments can help. And altogether, if assessments aren't all that would help overcome these challenges, you have government incentives sometimes. If you are trying to push security out at a smaller organization, especially something like a nonprofit, you might want to explore free help you can get. Or things like partnerships, where you can partner with a security company or solution, and they can give you, in turn for business help on their end, they can help implement these maybe more expensive or crafted solutions for you. And of course, finally, we want to keep in mind what we can control with these sort of security measures. So not everything has to be incredibly expensive. We want to think about what options we have that are cheap. Things like user training or basic endpoint security that, although it's not the most expensive, it can make a big difference in the long term. Okay, and that'll take us to our final thoughts here. So overall, we looked into the human element. We talked about how the human error and social engineering can play a major role in data breaches. We touched on the technical element, things like patch management, endpoint security, and network security, why that can be a big deal with preventing things from reaching the human element to begin with. And finally, the other elements, little external things here and there that can open a breach where you might otherwise have a secure business. Overall, let me give you a couple strategies to work with going forward and out of this. Of course, we talked a bit about embracing awareness and training. As you can see, things like those can play a big role in not just the human element, but keeping us up to date on technical elements. It's one of those things that where training and awareness are great for the sole purpose of what they do. They really do go, if done well, to help the whole of the information security system at an organization. Of course, past that, we want to think about patch management and vulnerability management as permanent processes to incorporate. Things like that plug into some sort of a ticket management system like Jira can seriously make a big help in managing the technical vulnerabilities that can arise over time. A lot of times, just knowing issues that exist can be a major challenge, and that can help shore it up there. And finally, of course, we always want to emphasize a proactive approach. Almost any time in security, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And threats can be multifaceted and super intelligent. They can come from many different areas. And so wherever we can, we want to keep ahead of the ball in terms of how we're going to, our approaches for fixing things, or incorporating new methodologies. We always want to think ahead at what could happen rather than find out a week ago something happened. What do we do? And that just about wraps it. My tips for preventing data breaches here. I'd like to invite you all to think of this webinar kind of like a toolkit. Any combination of the ideas I've given you here can be used on their own or in tandem, and they should prevent about 90% of data breaches altogether if done correctly. All right. Well, thanks. If that's all I had for the presentation here, I didn't know if we want to introduce the floor to any questions. Let's see, provided we don't have any questions here, I want to thank everyone for joining today.
Oh,
and
my mic was muted. Yes. That was great. Thank you, Alex. Since we don't have any questions, I would like to thank everyone so much for joining us. This is a wrap for our Webinar Wednesday series. Make sure to follow us on LinkedIn for the latest updates on our next one. And also, this webinar will be live on YouTube soon, so you can use it as a toolkit like Alex said. So please be on the lookout for that. And also visit our website at cyberdatapros.com for more information. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.